So, welcome to the first Best Practices Handbook Review webinar. I will be doing this every other month on the first Thursdays, and I'll try and remember to send out emails reminding you that this is coming up, and the Zoom link will be the same each time. So, for those of you who are new to libraries, welcome. And for those of you who are not new to libraries, welcome anyway. Best practices is something that we've had around since we've had a shared ILS, and that started in 1996. The guide used to be a little half-page neon pink thing that mostly showed us how to do things in our ILS. And it has really evolved into a way to share best practices to make things work smoothly, both for staff and for the patron experience. So why do we even have best practices guidelines? Because we have 28 different libraries, we have 28 sets of policies around circulation, around practices in the library, and all of those things are really important because local control is an important thing that we want to maintain. However, sharing a catalog means that materials and patron interactions are a lot more efficient. We can communicate better, share materials easier. It also comes with some challenges. So some practices need to be shared in order to help respect other libraries, patrons, and materials, to respect local policies. And there are some things that because we're sharing one single piece of software, we need to agree to do things the same way so that the experience works efficiently. So most of what is in this handbook are guidelines. And if your local practice is slightly different or varies in a small way, that's okay, as long as there's a reason for it and that change is intentional. There are some things that are rules that we've agreed on for the best interests of all of our patrons and all of our staff, and we will get to those. So I want to, again, reiterate what the best practices guide is. It is meant to assist your libraries in training and operations for your staff. It's meant as a support system and a reference for your staff to use when you're interacting with the ILS and with delivery. And it's a living document under constant review. So some of you may be in the best practices committee. Everybody is welcome to attend best practices committee meetings. And the committee is appointed by the Net Southwest Directors Council on an ongoing basis. People usually have a 2 to 3 year term, and we meet every other month. We are always going through different questions that arise at libraries, things that come up that are troublesome, ILS things like there was an update and now we need to learn how to work around something. So this is something that is under constant review. What the best practices guide is not, it is not intended to replace or hinder local control. So we want libraries to have their own policies. And throughout this document, there are numerous places where it just says, you should have a policy about this. Whatever it is, you should have a policy. This best practices guide is also not an encyclopedia of every single circumstance that could possibly be encountered in a library setting. So a lot of what we talk about in our best practices meetings is, well, what about when this happens? And what about when this happens? And there's no way we could create a document that could enumerate all of those different encounters or different situations or family situations or, well, because of this, then we can't do this. That's not what we're trying to do. We are trying to address the most common, most important, and essential practices in our libraries. This is also not a comprehensive training manual for staff. So this is not how to do stuff. This is what the practice should be. And how your library chooses to train your staff is kind of up to you. A lot of times I do create additional documentation to assist in those tasks. And in the appendix, of the best practices guide, there are a lot of how to do some of the things or a workflow that you could use or examples of things. But this is not a comprehensive training manual. So just reading this isn't going to teach people how to use the ILS, how to interact with all of the screens, what to do when the thing beeps, but the barcode isn't read. That stuff is still in-house training essentials. Any questions so far? Great. All right, we are going to start with rules that are part of the Net Southwest agreement. So just one slide ago, I said these are guidelines, not actual rules. There are some rules. And these rules are part of the Net Southwest agreement. All of your library boards have signed off on these. So these are things that you formally agree to do, not just kind of want to do, but you have actually formally agreed to these rules. The first one is really simple. Libraries have to fill reserves every day that you're open. So if you are open, you should be checking and filling your reserves with available copies list. That probably happens multiple times a day at your library. It's probably not just a one-off thing, but at least once a day, your library must fill the reserves with available copies if you're open. The next one is that newly acquired can only be used for the first 2 months that your library owns a material. The exception to that is if a material becomes like wildly popular. So a recent example would have been like when Where the Crawdads Sing was impossible to keep on shelves for like a year and a half. We gave people permission to keep that item on newly acquired to serve your patrons better for longer than 2 months. But for the most part, an item should only be on newly acquired for 2 months of the item's life in your library. Next up, a checkout period is based on the checkout library, not the owning library. And this is an important one because the way Verso sets things up, checkout period, loan period, and renewal period follows an item from the owning library. So if Richland Center loans things for a month, but Lancaster loans things for 2 weeks, if a Lancaster item goes to Richland Center to fill a hold, Richland Center is allowed to change that due date to 4 weeks because that's their policy. It has to be done on every item individually. There's not a way for us to change the rules in Verso. Unfortunately, I've checked. But it is allowed that you change those due dates based on your own library's policy when you're checking out in your own library. Likewise, if you don't charge fines, anything checked out in your library, those fines could be waived. We'll get to fines and stuff later, but this is one that isn't always that commonly talked about because checkout periods are for the most part either 2 weeks or 4 weeks for everything in the library. There are some exceptions, but most of our libraries have agreed to either 2 weeks or 4 weeks. But if you receive an item and the due date is different than your library policy, you are welcome to change it. The next rule is that libraries agree to the out-of-state card rules, and we have a whole section on rules and restrictions for our out-of-state cards. The reason this is important is because our out-of-state cards have a different barcode scheme. They start with 49896 or 59896 instead of what all of our regular blue cards do. And this is important because we are not allowed to share our Overdrive and Libby access with out-of-state patrons. We're not allowed by agreement with the whole state that out-of-state patrons are not allowed to access our Overdrive and Libby, even if they pay for card access. So out-of-state patrons must have out-of-state cards in order to disinvite them from Libby access. Next up is that SWLS may delete expired patron accounts that meet set criteria. That criteria is it has to be expired for at least 3 years. Any fines or fees have to be at least 10 years old, or under $50 with no lost items if they're 5 years old. So that is all laid out in the handbook, like very specifically what I can do. The reason that this became a rule is because libraries weren't keeping up on their own expired patron maintenance. And we were in danger of being audited by DPI because our patron account statuses were not current. So in order to assist you, everybody agreed that us at SWLS could help in these cases. That doesn't mean that libraries shouldn't be doing their own expired patron maintenance on a regular basis, but it gives us a way to be that backstop so that we don't end up in an audit situation. Next up, and arguably the most important one to me, is that staff follow security practices and that volunteers may not have staff access to the ILS. The security practices include keeping passwords private, changing passwords when staff leave, and not using staff access to do things to accounts like access patron address information or sharing patron phone numbers or things like that. And the next one is that volunteers and board members may not have staff access to the ILS. They're not trained in privacy. They're not employees that could have consequences if they do something wrong, but it creates a huge liability because our patron database is shared amongst 28 libraries. And so we don't know the level of training that volunteers are accessing, that volunteers are receiving. And so this was voted on and unanimously at that meeting agreed upon that volunteers may not have staff access to the ILS. So if you have volunteers in your library, you need to think about what practices you need to stop allowing them to have that might let them be using the ILS. They can search when it's not logged in as a staff. They can help patrons find materials if they're asking in person. They can shelve things. They can clean. There's all kinds of things volunteers can do that don't include staff access to Verso. But this one's really important to me because patron privacy is super important, and we are just trying to protect everybody. Next up is that libraries audit and correct patron accounts. This is kind of going back to that one before about deleting expired patrons. Libraries should be correcting patron accounts annually. And I send out reminders, at least to directors, if not to everybody, about check your township codes, check addresses, make sure resident and non-resident is correct. Please just take a look. And the reason is, again, because we rely on counties to pay funding for patron use depending on that township code. If we can't trust those township codes to be correct, then at some point a county could say, yeah, we're not paying this until you prove all of this use was actually by people who live in our county. And that could be problematic. We've never encountered that in the history of like SWLS at least. But we don't know when that could come up, and so keeping good records and maintaining those records is super important so that we never run into an issue. Or if there ever were a question, we'd feel really confident in handing over that documentation. The last one that's a rule, and I'm happy to say that everybody met it in 2025, libraries have to attend at least 3 out of 6 Net Southwest directors meetings. And that's because we talk about funding, we talk about rules, we talk about best practices, we talk about all kinds of things that really affect libraries. And we think it's really important that libraries are represented at those meetings so that they have a voice in decisions that are being made. So like I said, in 2025, every single library in our system made it to at least 3. And that was awesome. It's the first time since 2009, at least. And 2009 is when I started in the system. So that's as far back as I know. But it's the first time we've ever had every single library comply with this, which is super cool. I'm going to pause and see if anybody has any questions at this point. And hearing none, let's move on to Chapter 1 in the Best Practices Handbook. And Chapter 1 is cataloging, acquisitions, and holdings. And the things that we're going to talk about here include barcode placement on materials, how bibliographic records or bib records are deleted from Verso, how libraries should add and delete their holdings for library materials. That includes new materials, items with multiple volumes or multiple copies, withdrawing materials, and other rules about materials in Verso. It also will discuss ownership markings. So let's start with barcode placement. This has expanded in the last few years. It used to be for print materials that it had to be the top right corner of the first page or the title page of the material. We have expanded that to include the front cover in the top right corner because it made things easier for our self-checkout machines. So for print or AV, the front cover on the top right corner or on the inside in the top right corner if possible. Board books have an exception that allow the top right corner on the back of the book because sometimes the pictures on the inside of the book or the cover, that barcode would be a real problem for the patron experience. The big thing to remember is that wherever you put the barcode, make sure it's protected. So if you have a barcode stuck somewhere and it is peeling off or it's like getting damaged all the time, either put a protective sticker over it or find a better place to put it. Some libraries put the barcode under the slipcover on DVDs on the front so that it's protected by that plastic film. Some just put like a spine label protector over it wherever they put it. But the biggest problem we see often is that those barcodes fall out, especially in cold weather, if they're not stuck in really well. And that's not what we want to see. So barcodes should not be on the back of the item except for board books. They shouldn't be on the bottom of the item or in the middle or something because that's tough for barcode scanners. They also should not be handwritten or unscannable by a barcode reader. I will say that when Fenimore joined our ILS, we gave them an exception, a blanket exception for some of their barcodes. Handwritten ones needed to be replaced, but we did not make them change all of the barcodes on their materials because they were in the middle of weeding anyway. So they're working toward compliance with this, but know that they are allowed to not replace all of their barcodes. If you get one that is unscannable at any library, use a problem item form and send it back and say, hey, this didn't scan. Maybe you need to replace the barcode. Not a big deal. It's not a judgment. It happens to all of us. We just want to help the owning libraries maintain their stuff. They may not notice, or they may be so used to it, they're not seeing like how faded something is or something like that. So just use a problem item form and send it home with that little note saying, hey, take a look at this. Barcodes on kits should be somewhere that's scannable and somewhere obvious to find. So it's a little tougher when it's like this great big bin or something like that, but try and find a place that's really obvious and scannable so that libraries that are borrowing your materials or getting those in return know how to check it in and send it home. All right. Next up is database holdings maintenance, and this is just an explanation. So the difference between a bib record and an item record. A bib record is the thing that SWLS adds to the catalog. An item record or an item holding, and I'll refer to them as holdings throughout, is your material attached to that bib record. So you are responsible for adding and deleting your own items or your own holdings to the records. You are not responsible for creating or deleting bib records or bibliographic records. SWLS has processes in which we remove them quarterly. The reason we prefer to do it ourselves is because we have to often update OCLC. Once a year, we offer OCLC a look at the catalog and they can update our holdings in their, whatever their ILS is or whatever. So often if you delete the last item on a bib record, you'll get this delete item. Are you sure you want to delete? Yeah, I want to delete it. It's been lost for a year and a half. Like it's not coming back. Delete my item. If it was the last holding, this second pop-up comes up saying this bib record has no items. Do you want to delete the bib record? You're not supposed to have permission to do this. I'm working on it. But in the meantime, please hit cancel. Do not hit delete. So it's really easy to just like get in like this click happy mode and just click delete, 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 delete. Please do not delete the bib record. Is it going to be the end of the world? No, probably not. It just means that OCLC's records aren't going to be as accurate. But it would be great if you could remember and remind your staff not to delete that bib record because we will do it at the system level. So let's talk a little bit about adding materials. The general workflow for adding materials is that libraries add items to the cataloging app. The cataloging app was built by Prairie Lakes Library System for us as a way to automate the copy cataloging process. And it gets materials into the catalog much faster, overnight actually, always overnight, even if it's a short record, which we can then later overlay or enhance with a full record. So it reduces the amount of wait time you are experiencing waiting to get your materials into the catalog. Next, once the cataloging app loads those bib records into Verso, you can add your holdings to the correct bib record. We require that you add all circulating material to Verso. So if you circulate it to your patrons regularly, you should have it in Verso so that it is findable, reportable, so we can collect statistics on it. It's just a consistent way to approach library service. So if you have things that are not in the catalog, you should talk to us and we can get records together for you. Libraries should avoid using brief bibs for permanent materials. So a brief bib is something where you scan an item, it doesn't come up, and it says, do you want to create a brief bib? Well, you can check it out to that one patron and then get it back and create a regular record. That's totally fine if it's a one-off. However, if you have a thing that you circulate all the time, whether it's magazines or whether it's like this piece of equipment, whatever it is, if you circulate it regularly and you intend to circulate it regularly, rather than having a brief bib that you keep creating over and over, you should have a permanent bib record in the system, and we can help you create those. We get better statistics this way. We can track materials, lost materials, stuff like that a lot better, and it really cleans up the search function. So that's why we're asking everybody to help us with that. Libraries also need to ensure that they're adding their holdings to the correct records. So when you're searching to add a material, you should, oh, I see a comment here. Sarah says, I always thought the brief bib was more helpful when we had humans helping catalog items before the app came. That's very true. When you were waiting 2 or 3 weeks for an item, that brief bib function was a lot more helpful because you could circulate your item while you were waiting for the regular bib record to be entered into Verso. Now it happens overnight. So there's a lot fewer instances of you like needing to get something out before you could get it in the catalog. So I agree, Sarah. All right, so next, libraries should ensure they add their holding to the correct record. So search by the ISBN or the UPC if you can to make sure that you're getting to the right record. More importantly, check that the format is right. Take a look at that full record and make sure it's the title you said that you have in hand, that it is a DVD and not a Blu-ray, or it's a book and not an audio book, or whatever that format is that you're adding. Make sure it's the right thing. Um, and if there are other things already added to that record, make sure that yours matches, or if it doesn't match, see if you're wrong or if they're wrong. If you see one that's wrong and it's not your item that you can't fix, just let SWLS know. We'll look into it. We'll do the communication about moving things to the correct record, stuff like that. And if you see a record and it's got the right ISBN, but it has the wrong format, or there's something that's just wonky and you don't know, reach out to Ed at SWLS and just say, hey, I noticed this. Can you look at it? Every once in a while, things happen. We're happy to take a look at it if you have a question. And we'd rather you feel confident in what you're adding so that it can be found in the catalog and borrowed by patrons and things just work smoothly. For items that have multiple holdings or things like that, so like periodicals, DVDs where you are adding like multiple discs to one record, use the enumeration in the volume area for those records. And the reason we ask that you use it there instead of just in the call number is that it's really easy when you're doing a reserve to find the right item if you use the enumeration in the volume areas. So in the volume area, it'd be like discs 1 and 2 or discs 3 through 5. And for the enumeration thing, it would be like spring 2025 issue of whatever magazine. So any questions about adding materials? We will talk about adding materials pre-pub when we get to the circulation chapter, but I'll just mention right now, since we're talking about adding materials, you may add your materials to a bib record before the publication date, but you must leave it as in process and don't circulate that item until the release date of that material. So, and we do have some libraries that do it on accident on occasion. We're not going to tell on you, but it's important to try and pay attention to those release dates. So I guarantee patrons are paying attention. All right, let's move on to deleting, because as soon as you add stuff, you have to delete stuff, right? To make room. Most of you probably have to make room. So withdrawn items should be removed from Verso, or if you aren't the director and you don't have the authority to do that, move them to a non-available status like deleted. The big thing here is just don't leave them as available and pull them off your shelves, because then other libraries are trying to borrow them and you won't send them, and it just causes confusion. So move them to a status like deleted if you are planning to withdraw them permanently from your collection. If you have to pull it because it's damaged and you plan to replace it, you can use a status like damaged or mending. But if the item's not available on your shelves, the item shouldn't say available. Next up is physical items should be marked to indicate that they're withdrawn. This is a new rule that we just added last year, that we are requiring that physical items should be marked in at least 2 different ways to indicate that they're withdrawn. If you have a withdrawn stamp, you can stamp the barcode, stamp your ownership markings, etc. If you don't have a withdrawn stamp or can't afford it, that's totally fine. Use a permanent marker and cross out or remove the barcode. Cover with a sticker or cross out the spine label with permanent marker. Cross out ownership markings, scribble on them, and that works just as well as a withdrawn stamp. Totally fine. The big thing is that we have a lot of instances where materials from your book sale end up in a book drop at another library. They don't understand that it's a withdrawn material and then have problems scanning and sending it because it's withdrawn. So it's not showing up in Verso. So if you can make it very clear that the item has been withdrawn from your collection, that helps all of the neighborhood libraries when your stuff inevitably ends up in their book drop or in the little free library or in your, freebie paperback rack. So make sure that two things, I would argue that the spine label is just as important as the barcode, because if I am looking on a shelf at a thrift shop, a shelf in a little free library, if I see a spine label, I'm pulling that because I think that's a library book and I'm trying to help somebody out. And I would imagine there's plenty of patrons out there that are like, oh, I recognize this is a library material. I'm going to go throw that in a book drop because it probably didn't belong here. So the clearer you can make it, the better off we will all be. Last, just a reminder, SWLS will handle deleting empty bib records. I do it quarterly right now and keep records of what we delete. Anything that is older than a year, a bib record that is older than a year gets deleted. So it's also important if you're adding new materials to get your stuff on those bib records before I delete them. Any questions about withdrawing materials? Reach out to me if you want me to help you with a weeding project. It's one of my favorite things to do. All right. Let's talk a little bit about a couple other conditions and restrictions just regarding materials in Verso. One thing that I don't have written down, but is very important, especially with all of the library of things that you guys are collecting, is to make sure that your materials are packaged in a way that is clearly a library item. And if you're going to have them go through delivery in a safe way, make sure they're packaged in a way that like the things can be together. So that's something to think about, and we can help you with recommendations if you're looking for help. So here is where I mentioned new item holdings that can be added before publication, but they must be put in the in-process status. There are some things that we do not allow in Verso, and these have become pretty popular for us to talk about at like every Net Southwest meeting. We talk about this type of stuff. I bring it up a lot. I am always looking for it. Ed is always on the lookout for it, and he's got a really good eye. So one thing we don't allow is advanced review copies. They're not meant for general consumption. They typically don't have correct cover art. They have things that get changed. Even sometimes titles get changed. Those advanced review copies sometimes filter to libraries as donations. Sometimes you get them if you go to like an ALA or a PLA or something like that. Those may not be circulated. So we don't allow them in Verso. Next up is items not owned by the library. So sometimes there will be things that are on loan to you. Like I know an example would be there were blood pressure cuffs at some libraries that were not owned by the library. They weren't donations or anything. They were owned by the health department. Those can't be circulated. Legally, we cannot count circulation of items not owned by libraries. So if it's not owned by the library, we don't allow it in Verso. If, however, that blood pressure cuff was donated specifically to your library, you can go ahead and add it and circulate it. Totally fine. But this is more of like a rule about what circulation is as far as annual report statistics go. Items that are identified as bootleg or counterfeit are not allowed in Verso. So we have a lot of DVDs that come through that are not allowed. Oh, Joe says, so let's say if someone donates a sixth season of a particular DVD series prior to the actual release date, yes, that would be a bootleg copy of that DVD series. It's probably going to be low quality anyway, but yes, if we catch it, we'll make you remove it because they're not allowed. Not speaking from experience at all. You are not the only one. We have pulled them from probably over half of our libraries. It happens. It's super easy to happen. And they're getting better and better at hiding that they're bootlegs. It's tough to tell sometimes. So if you ever have a question about one, ask Ed or ask myself, and we're happy to review them. We also have seen counterfeit magazines. Believe it or not, when Betty White died, we had a magazine come through that looked like the People like special issue of a Betty White magazine, but it was not real. It was like a counterfeit fake thing. And that was really confusing. It was the first time we had a print bootleg come through the system. So, but it can happen. And last but not least, we have agreed that items that are identified as being created through deceptive generative AI are not allowed in Verso. So this is restricted to items that are marketed as nonfiction and could be harmful in some way. So if it's just an AI fiction book, we're probably going to tell you about it, but let it go. If it is meant to be nonfiction, or if it could be potentially harmful in some way, if it could be, low quality or damaging or inaccurate, we will not allow that in Verso. Now, we can't stop you from circulating it. You have local control over what's in your collection. But because we need to protect the integrity of our shared collection, we won't let that be in Verso. If you have questions about that, or if you have an item that you wanted to circulate and you don't care that it's AI, you can talk to me about what options you have for circulating that in your own library. But it cannot go in Verso, and we do not want you sharing it with other libraries. So, and Joe mentioned that Ed caught it before it got out. Their bootlegs. Ed is, like I said, excellent at seeing those things come through. We also communicate with other library systems, and there's kind of like this shared statewide, like, hey, this is a bootleg that's coming out, and it's a popular thing, so watch for it. So we kind of are watching for those things that are questionable also. Any questions about things that cannot be in Verso? Some of these are coming up more and more because of like how prolific AI is and how tricky those bootlegs are getting and things like that. We do have bootleg training. So we've got a 15-minute session. We also have a slideshow to help people identify counterfeit and bootleg materials and AI materials. So if you have questions about that, let us know and we can send you some more information. All right. The last item in this chapter is ownership markings. And we've got lots of like recommendations of where you could do it, how you could do it, how things work. The ultimate goal and the bottom line is that your thing should look like a library thing. Your book should look like a library book. Your DVD should look like a DVD that belongs to a library so that if it is found out in the wild, it can be returned to a library. So stamps or stickers on covers, title pages, the edge of the pages, whatever your local practice is, that's totally fine. Have a spine label. If it goes on a shelf on an edge, have a spine label so that it can be immediately identified from the outside of the item as a library book. We've had a lot of libraries have these like freebie paper book exchange racks that aren't part of the regular collection. They're not being circulated for numbers or anything like that. They're just there for people. But library materials have ended up on those paperback exchanges because they don't, from the outside, look like library materials. They don't have spine labels, they don't have book covers, anything like that. And so by having that spine label or that minimum ownership marking on the exterior of the material, your stuff is less likely to end up in those exchanges or in a donation bin at the thrift shop or wherever. So items with parts like DVDs or kits should have ownership markings on as many pieces as possible. So DVDs should have it on the DVD itself, whether you write it with a marker or you have a hub sticker, whatever your process is fine, as long as it can be identified if it gets separated from its case. On kits, you have to see what's realistic. It's probably not realistic to mark every single card in a board game or every single like puppet that is just fabric. Um, some of those things are not realistically like able to be marked with ownership markings, but do what you can to try and make it look like library things. And also don't forget to add ownership markings to periodicals because those often we can't tell at all. And we found the easiest way is if you have address labels, just slap one on the front. But when they come through delivery, it's often near impossible for us to tell what library it belongs to unless we can find a barcode. So those ownership markings are really important. It helps you get your materials back, and things end up in the wild a lot. So the easier it is for us to find its home, the more likely it is to make it home. Does anybody have any questions about anything related to materials, acquisitions, any of this stuff? I'm happy to answer questions now before we move on to chapter 2. All right, then let's move on to the second chapter in the Best Practices Handbook, which is circulation. This is a long chapter, and we will not get through the whole thing today. So wherever we stop, I will do a quick review and pick up from where we left off at our next Best Practices webinar, which will be happening in April. So the things that we'll be covering in the circulation chapter are reserves in verso and WSCAT or SIL, blocking and limiting reserves, checkout and renewal periods, checkout and renewal limits, how to handle fines, charges, fees, how we manage long overdue items, payments for lost items or damaged items, patron notices for overdues, and what happens in a user account. So messages, notes, and comments, and things like that, and how we communicate with other libraries about those issues. Throughout this chapter, we'll be talking in two parts about most of these things. So in verso, that would be the materials that you borrow and loan from other SWLS libraries. There's a set of rules for those. There is a different, slightly different set of rules for doing things in SIL or WSCAT. So that would be ILL materials from outside of our system. And I call it SIL/WSCAT throughout because people who have been around a long time know it as WSCAT. It is the statewide system for interlibrary loan. People who have only ever worked in SWLS in the last few years often only know it as SIL, which is Circ ILL, and it is right inside of the Verso module. So they don't always connect it with WSCAT. So I call it both because that's what it is. So when you're placing reserves, the biggest thing is make sure you're placing it for the right patron. There's a lot of duplicate names. Everybody knows there's 9 million people with the same last name and a lot of people with the same first name. So ensure that you're choosing the correct patron account. Um, you should also have policies about who can place a reserve on a patron account. So don't just allow any old random person to place a reserve for Christine because they think that she should read that book. That's not how library circulation should work. But you should have a policy in your own library regarding those rules. In SIL or WSCAT, always search Verso first. Some libraries don't allow all staff to do WSCAT searches, some do, but no matter what your rules in-house are, Verso should be the first place you look. So check SWLS first. If it's available in SWLS, even if it's not available at the moment, so if somebody's got it checked out, you should be checking out in Verso and waiting for the copy in SWLS. So in either place, for multiple copies, there is like a different way to request those materials. In Verso, if you need multiple copies to fill book club requests, or if you need a specific item, like I only need discs 3 through 5 of Game of Thrones season 4, in the reserve screen, you uncheck any item and click each specific one. If you check 4 items are going to come. So just remember that like once you uncheck any item, any subsequent check marks means that many things are coming from those specific locations. And also a reminder that the rotating collections are not reservable materials. So we have audiobook rotating collection, a large type rotating collection, and a Spanish language collection. Those are browsing collections that libraries opt in to participate in. You'll see them, the material types are always like ABC1 or SLC 17 or whatever. So those are not things that you can reserve and borrow regularly. And the Spanish language one happens a lot with like schools want those things, but they aren't reservable. So it's just a reminder that when somebody comes in with a question, that's kind of one of the things about those collections. In SIL or WSCAT, the rule is that you may not request items that were published in the last 6 months, period. Probably every library, at least every library that's in this meeting, but probably every library in our system has gotten an email from me saying, hey, I had to cancel this request because it's just too new. I'm not judging you for it. It happens all the time. Like I said, every library has done it. But do your best to check publication dates before you are requesting out in SIL or WSCAT. And if you're doing it for a book club, that has to be at least a year old. So if you have a book club that likes to read the newest thing, encourage them to either get really popular stuff or make sure there's enough copies in Verso before they choose that material, because you cannot request book club stuff in WSCAT for a year. And I'll just cancel those requests and email you about them when they happen. So blank requests should only be used as a last resort. You should search for an item and try and find a record first, because a blank request is less likely to get filled in general, and it will take longer. If there is a record in SIL or in WSCAT for an item, even if there's no holdings on it, you're better off requesting that than doing a blank request, because at least the system can automate that search beyond Wisconsin libraries based on a record. So, and then for book club requests, there is a multi-copy request button, and it's way to your benefit to use that multi-copy request rather than singly requesting 7 copies. The reason being that when a request goes out in SIL or WSCAT, it follows the same path from library to library. If you do a multi-copy request, all of those copies go to different libraries instead of all to the same libraries in the same order. That will speed up the pace in which you will receive those materials. So it's way to your benefit to use a multi-copy request to get multiple copies for a book club in SIL. All right, let's talk about filling reserves. And the very first thing we talk about is one of those rules that's not just a recommendation. You must fill reserves every day that the library is open. The expectation is that you fill things promptly or that you communicate why you can't. So if an item isn't in a non-circulating category like a violin that isn't going in delivery or a newly acquired collection, send it. And if you can't find it on your shelf, which happens to all of us, if you can't find it within a week, you should mark it missing. If you are the only library that owns that material, please communicate with either the borrowing library or the patron that requested it so that they know they're not getting their thing. Because if you just mark the only copy missing after someone has it on hold, it's just going to sit on hold and no one gets notified. And then the patron wonders, like, why aren't they getting their thing? And the library has no idea they're upset. So if you are moving something to missing or damaged or whatever, and it's the only copy to fill a hold, you should let someone know. In SIL and WSCAT, you are agreeing to follow state guidelines. They have a whole document about what the rules are for borrowing and loaning in WSCAT. The biggest thing is if it is a format that you won't loan, you shouldn't borrow it. So if you won't loan your video games out, you shouldn't try and borrow video games from WSCAT. If you won't lend your kits, you shouldn't borrow kits. So basically just only borrow what you're willing to share. If you have requests in SIL or WSCAT for an item in your library, you should make sure to fill any SWLS holds before you send it in WSCAT. So try and share within us before you share without. And here is what I would, let's take a look. So for rotating LTE, what can I do if I have a homebound patron reading a series and the only large print version is in the rotating collection? Is there any way I can obtain it for my patron through the system instead of WSCAT? It happens a lot with Westerns. That is a really good question, Karen. So in this case, you can contact the library that has that rotating collection at the time and see if they're willing to loan it to your patron. They aren't obligated to, but it would be faster, and most of the time they're willing to loan it. And in that case, they would either have to just check it straight out to the patron or send it with a blue routing label to you with a note saying, upon request, so that you can check it out to your patron. So that is an exception. You can ask the library if they're willing to loan it to you, because it would be a lot faster than going out to WSCAT to get the same thing that's sitting on someone's shelf. Sarah said she's had a wonderful experience with this. And I will say that I've asked libraries about Spanish language stuff on behalf of like a teacher trying to teach a student who doesn't speak English or speaks very little English. And I've had a good experience working directly with the library that has the material at the time. So that's totally fine to have a conversation with the library and ask if it's okay. So great question. All right, the last slide we're going to get to today is some special considerations. And basically, it's just the politeness rule. Treat other libraries' materials with respect. So don't stamp in their stuff. Don't put stickers in their stuff. Don't alter their materials without permission because it's not your stuff. So if you stamp due dates in your own materials, put it on a sticky note. Don't stamp in somebody else's materials. Also, before you return a material, whether it came in delivery and it was missing stuff or whether it came back from a patron, check that the item is complete. So make sure all of the discs are in a DVD case. Make sure all of the pieces are in a kit. You can help others do this for you by keeping a contents list in any kit that you send out so that it's an easy thing to check that all the pieces are there. If you don't have a contents list, it's pretty hard to know if there's something missing. Um, if there is an item found to be damaged, found to be missing stuff, there is a problem item form that all of your libraries have access to. If you don't have any printed, you can find it on our website. There's instructions on the back of the form with exactly what to do. And on the front of the form, it just gives you some basic information to help the library that owns the material follow up and resolve the issue. So this can be used if a barcode doesn't scan, if the DVD skipped all the time and the patron had a bad experience, if there is an arm ripped off of that stuffy that was in the kit, if this kit is supposed to have 26 stamps, but it's only got 22, whatever the issue. So use this form when you send the item back so that the library knows how to follow up with it. Does anybody have any questions about these forms or anything that we've discussed today? All right. I am going to slide through a couple of these so that you can see this slide before the end of today. Remember that you have the full handbook at your fingertips. If you are a staff member, you can log into Verso with your own staff account and find the SWLS help page across the top by the dashboards. In that is the Google link to the Best Practices Handbook. It is the most updated copy, and it's always being updated. If you are a print person, your library should also have a green binder, chartreuse green, super loud color. And we sent out at the end of December brand new pages for this handbook. So it should also be the most updated copy right now. And you can access it there at your library at any time. If you go to our website under staff resources, you can also find the Google link to this best practices handbook. Or if you ever talk to me ever, I will send it to you. So I want it to be really easy for you to refer to. I want it to be really easy for you to look something up if you just don't remember. And if you ever have any questions, always reach out to me or anyone on the Best Practices Committee, and we'd be happy to help you out. So thank you to those of you who came today. Next time, we will pick up right where we left off in the middle of the circulation chapter and keep moving through. They will always be recorded, and I'll be putting them up on our YouTube channel. We'll also make sure to send out that recording to all of the libraries so they have access to it at a later date. So thank you for coming, and I hope that you all have a great day.